Sophie Barat. Constance is her name, and it describes her fidelity to Sophie Barat. Connie has worked with Sacred Heart educators many times, and we are fortunate to have her with us today to help us understand more deeply the founding vision of St. Madeleine Sophia Barat and ways that Sophie calls us forward at this point in our history. Arigato gozaimasu, and a warm welcome to Connie Solari.
Good morning to all of you. I will try to speak slowly. I have the group from Taiwan is keeping me slowed down. I'm counting on you. It is my very great honor to be with all of you this morning. The presentations this morning took me into places within the network that I barely knew existed, and gives me, once again, a sense of working for such a magnificent international enterprise that is grounded in a space where things should be grounded. I thank all of the hospitality that I've received in Tokyo and at Fuji, where I was able to visit for 3 nights last week at the retreat house, an experience I recommend to many of you. So here we go. Let me get my card. This is my children's dog. When I was a senior in high school, my English teacher suggested that we all write letters to ourselves, predicting where we would be 10 years from that moment. We were supposed to give the letter to someone who would keep it safe for 10 years, at which point we would open them. I imagined myself to be unmarried, living somewhere in Europe, and working for the United Nations or some other international organization that would connect me with the larger world. I was ambivalent about getting married or ever having children. And the one thing I knew I would never do is teach high school. My mother and both of my grandmothers were teachers. I opened the letter at age 27 in Northern California, where I was now happily married and teaching high school English. My second child was sitting on my lap. So much for planning one's life. I didn't realize then, of course, that a series of coincidences or miracles or something had led me into a profession that would eventually take me to Europe, South America, India, and now Japan. Nor did I imagine that I would be engaging with religious and lay educators around the globe who are engaged in an enterprise that almost from its beginning has had the sense of internationality and that had schools on multiple continents. You embody in these places an educational philosophy whose brilliance and farsightedness I still find astonishing. For over 40 years, I enjoyed a career that included teaching high school English, writing for the advancement office, serving as academic dean and dean of faculty, and overseeing special projects. And then in 2008, for reasons that still are unknown to me. I was invited to give a talk to the leadership teams of the United States schools on my relationship with St. Madeleine Sophie. At that point, I had really no idea what that relationship was, but I had been doing a great deal of reading about Sophie, and so I spent the next 6 months preparing a speech. And when that speech had finished, a friend of mine said, "You really should write a novel about this woman." I did. My head of school gave me a sabbatical that allowed me to write for 8 months. I spent a month living in Sophie's home, living within a French community of nuns, and really being able to absorb the spirit of Sophie in a way that I hadn't before that. What writing the book also allowed me to do was to realize that I would be very happy as a writer. It was about time for me to retire. And so I stepped down from my job 3 years later so that I could write full time, which is what I do now. But it would appear that Sophie isn't quite finished with me because I'm still giving talks here and there. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be with you. My new life has obviously allowed me much more time to explore and ponder the current state of our world. Of particular interest to me right now is how technology and increasingly divisive politics, we heard some of it mentioned this morning, are impacting education. I live only 15 minutes from Stanford University, and I have several friends who teach there. One of them has authored several powerful books on philosophy and literature. He is currently very interested, excuse me, in the links between literature and the worlds of science and technology. And last fall, he was part of a panel for a Stanford conference entitled Technology, Tragedy or Transcendence. The promotional brochure read as follows: technological advances in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, together with rekindled concern over the prospect of nuclear annihilation, call into question the ultimate arc of our escalating powers over the natural world. Some of the discussions centered around decreasing enrollment in humanities courses, dramatic cutbacks in humanities programs throughout the university system, and the impact this will have on future generations and on the very humanity of our being. This past May, I traveled to the annual Charleston Festival in Sussex, England, held at the home of Virginia Woolf's sister. It was a festival that brings together writers, critics, and change makers to speak on a variety of topics. The last day I was there, I heard a political journalist and a former United Nations advisor and geopolitics expert discuss what they called the seismic shift occurring today within global power structures, and along with it, the sense that we are moving toward a new world order. We live in very uncertain times in which the role of education becomes increasingly crucial, and where the definition and parameters of education are becoming increasingly unclear, where culture wars and political considerations are uprooting centuries-old assumptions about what we teach and how we teach it, where students and their parents are increasingly anxious about preparing their children for a future that technology is reshaping at a blistering pace, and where the future of what it means to be a human being often seems to be under threat. It is by means of this circuitous introduction that I hope to bring us to Sophie. In his poem, Four Quartets, T.S. Eliot writes of something he calls the still point. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point, there the dance is. But neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. This morning, I want us to think of Sophie as this still point, and the dance as our educational enterprise. So hold on to this idea while I introduce or reintroduce you to the Sophie I came to know while I reimagined her into a novel. I propose to introduce her using a template I first encountered as a graduate student at UCLA. I was studying comparative literature, and I had been thrown in to teach a freshman humanities seminar where the reading list included Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, a novel about which I knew nothing. None of the other teaching assistants knew anything, but we were in charge of the discussion groups. As fate would have it, my discussion group included a 20-year-old freshman whose mother was a professor of comparative literature and whose mother had corresponded with Tolstoy's daughter for 20 years. So I thought it wise to hand the discussion over to him that day, and he spoke of how the four brothers represent, each of them, a fundamental aspect of our human nature. Ivan is intellect, Dmitri is passion, Alyosha is heart, and Smerdyakov is instinct. For Dostoevsky, the only human being who held those four quadrants in place was Jesus Christ. This idea, for whatever reason, has always stayed with me, and I've developed a habit of sort of quadrantizing people to sort of figure out how they're balanced and weighed, although the names for the quadrants might change. By the end of the day, I'd like us to see Sophie in terms of four essential quadrants, aspects that we ourselves might become more fully aware of as we develop through our lives as Sacred Heart educators. They're quadrants that I identified in a speech I made almost 15 years ago, and I still hold to them. But rather than tell you what they are right at this minute, I'd like to evoke them, or begin to evoke them, through a series of bullet points about Sophie's life, a life that mirrored the birth of modern Europe. Sophie, too, was born in a moment when I think seismic plates were shifting around, at least in Europe. She was born 2 months premature in the midst of a raging fire that threatened to destroy the neighborhood. You can see the burn marks on the Barat home. And it sent her mother into early labor. The baby never should have survived 2 months early in 1779. She was raised in a petit bourgeois family amidst the vineyards of Burgundy, just south of Paris. Her father made wine barrels and also either rented or owned land where he cultivated the vines. This was an enterprise for the entire town of Joigny. She was educated by her older brother Louis, a devoted young priest who, like most people in this part of France, was severely influenced by Jansenism. This is not her brother, but it's sort of what I imagine Louis to have looked like. This particular sect of Catholicism was puritanical. It believed in a harsh, punishing God, and hell was a large part of that vision. You behaved in a certain way so you didn't end up damned forever. Louis was Sophie's godfather and her teacher, and a figure who, happily for us, did recognize her extraordinary intellect. He gave her an education far beyond that which any woman in France would have received at that time, with one possible exception whom I'll mention in a minute. He was a man of strong religious principles and barely escaped being guillotined during the French Revolution. So this is an image many people associate with the French Revolution, where people in droves, including nuns and priests, were decapitated by this supposedly humane method of executing people. Before he was imprisoned in Paris, he sent the family an image of the Sacred Heart. Why? Given his Jansenist leanings, we don't know. But apparently Madame Barat put it up on the wall, and this spirituality of the Sacred Heart was very seductive to Sophie because it responded to her warm, loving, non-puritanical disposition. This devotion again focused on God's love and mercy for his human creatures. Louis brought her to Paris in her mid-teens when the terror in the streets had settled down, and she lived in what might be called today an underground religious cell. The terror had ended, but priests who hadn't signed this loyalty oath were still being deported to Cayenne, some island off of South America somewhere. So they were living secretly as a group of Christians under a priest who was a non-juror priest. And here Sophie taught, she sewed, she read the church fathers in Greek and Latin. She also read Italian. She read Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian when she was a teenager. And she read Don Quixote in Spanish. So this woman was, a linguist par excellence. She was named head of a new religious order at age 20 by a priest who saw her leadership potential, but refused her plea that she wasn't ready for it yet. She was then marginalized and sabotaged by a priest and a nun from an order prior to the revolution. She was an older woman and thought that this new house should be run the way things were run before the revolution. So she was terribly, terribly marginalized, and it was at that point, happily, she took the trip to Grenoble, which is where she met Philippines, so it had a good outcome. For the next few years, she moved about the country. She met Philippine Duchesne in Grenoble. This is the school in Anima. This is the first school where she worked. So she met Philippine here in Grenoble. This is now a museum, but you can visit it. It's a beautiful spot. She also went to Poitiers, where she founded another house. And it was at Poitiers that she began to come up with, using the spiritual exercises of Loyola, she came up with the way in which she wanted her religious to be formed in this sort of spiritual notebook, I suppose, there's a better word for it. While she was here, she went to Bordeaux and brought down a group of women who would run up into the vineyards of Bordeaux to form their own religious community. And the bishop called Sophie down to Bordeaux and said, please bring these women down, and she accepted all of them into her order. What's very hard for us to understand is that this was a moment in the French church where it was reinventing itself after having been decimated by the revolution. All the convents were closed, all the orders were made illegal. So it was women like this, who were eager to have religious life, and it was a moment when, as you'll see, Sophie was able to form an order which was very different from what had preceded the revolution. In France, at this point, a series of revolutionary governments had been supplanted by Napoleon. One of the things I discovered when I was researching her is that Napoleon opened her mail. She was corresponding with a Jesuit priest. The Jesuits made Napoleon very nervous because they were their own network, and Sophie was drawn into that sort of circle of suspects. But he left her alone. I think he felt she was raising good Catholic housewives who would become good educated citizens or something. After the restoration of the monarchy, she was befriended by Bourbon kings. These are the kings, of course, who had preceded the revolution, so they were relatives of Louis XVI. And something that happened was that this family, the kings, the aristocracy, had really co-opted the emblem of the Sacred Heart as their own. So there is an affiliation between the devotion to the Sacred Heart and the aristocracy that became something Sophie had to work through because she did not wish to appear to be that kind of school. However, the aristocracy, the king at the time, did help to pay for the school in Paris, which today is the Rodin Museum. So if you go to Paris, you can visit Sophie's school. It's full of sculptures. She was forced at this time to engage in convoluted political games with the Vatican and the French bishops. This had been an issue for the Catholic Church for centuries. Dante writes about this tension. And it had to do with who was really going to control this group of feisty women that were traveling around. Again, this was unheard of before Sophie. And it came to a point where the order could have experienced a schism. Half of the nuns were all for the French bishops taking control. Half the nuns wanted the Vatican, he was their Vatican protector, who had been their protector, and they wanted him to continue that way. And Sophie, it took 3 years, and this is where I think she used the phrase, I watch, I listen, I pray. And she managed to bring these two forces together, keep all of her schools, and move forward. That's one of the most magical stories about Sophie I know, this way of bringing together two bastions of male power. And nobody lost. She was a conciliator. She was ill throughout her life. Illness was part of Sophie's being. She had various injuries, and she took a lot of sick leave that might well have been a proactive way of saving her energies for the onerous job that she had. But life expectancy then for a woman was 43. She lived to be 85 years old. So she managed her health well. She never allowed herself to be photographed. The archivist in Rome a few years ago did send me this photo, which is the only photo we have of Sophie alive. And you can't really see her very well, but there she is in Rome. And we have the photo of her on her deathbed. So who was she, really? One of the 4 quadrants I identified in Sophie years ago was the romantic, with a capital R. Some of you may be familiar with this late 18th century, early 19th century European phenomenon, an intellectual and artistic movement emblemized by Beethoven's music, Wordsworth's poetry, Francisco Goya's paintings. It's sometimes described as a reaction to the Enlightenment and the dehumanization of the Industrial Revolution. It returned value to the emotions, to the power of intuition, to the value of the personal. And it expressed a deeply spiritual connection between nature and the human being, who sought healing and renewal in its beauty. It is this aspect of Romanticism that connects it with Sophie. In this respect, it also enjoys a deep connection to Buddhist and Taoist poetry. I love to imagine Sophie as a small child running through the vineyards above Joigny. To this day, if you walk up the street from her family home, you're amidst acres of Pinot vines in minutes. Her biographers often mention how her mother would keep watch for Louis approaching the house so she could call Sophie down from the vineyards and make it look like she'd been studying. Joigny depended for its financial well-being on the production of a light rosé wine called Vin Gris. It's still produced today. She would have been part of the annual vendange, the grape harvest that brought the entire community together in something that would have resembled a communal act of worship. Sophie enjoyed a close connection with her father, who was viscerally tied to the earth. As one biography of Sophie states, being a wine grower and barrel maker was considered a noble trade with centuries of culture and spirituality behind it. So Sophie, from her birth, intimately connected with agricultural cycles that in her day were tied to religious festivals. I imagine her with her shoes off and the fine Burgundian terroir between her toes, feeling the sacramental quality of her connection to the earth. I never in my research encountered any information on the family dog or cat, but I took a picture of this cat right across the street from Sophie's house, and I like to imagine that Sophie might have once stroked one of its ancestors. What we do know is that Sophie had an extraordinary connectedness with animals. There are many stories of how she literally would bring a certain bird to her windowsill in Italy, or how little lambs would frolic around her when she was on the hills up near the Trinità. So perhaps part of it is to attach her in some way to St. Francis of Assisi, who had that very close communion. But it does, to me, indicate that she was very much caught up in that spirit of oneness with nature and with the larger natural world. So, as I watch my former colleague, Stuart Slafter, manage the farm at our school in Atherton, a campus that includes goats, chickens, rabbits, and turkeys, as well as extensive organic gardens, all of it worked by students, faculty, and staff, sometimes even by parents and their children. This is an olive harvest that we have every year. I like to think of this aspect of Sophie. Through Stuart's imagination and hard work, our community, from the youngest child to the retired religious at Oakwood, the retirement home which we have on our campus, enjoys direct connection with the cycles of life, even if it's just the pungent smell of the barnyard as you walk past it. Here in the midst of Silicon Valley, the home of technology on steroids, we make goat cheese. We grow dino kale, radicchio, tramontino squash, and yes, harvest the occasional rabbit or young male goat, but always with a prayer. This is Stuart's way of sacramentalizing the ordinary. He is aware of the holiness of his enterprise. As a teacher, he's also a history teacher, but also as director of this curriculum program that extends to all of our students. And I hope that this idea of sacramentalizing the ordinary is something we can talk about later this afternoon. As it seems most of you are well aware, Goal 3 of the Sacred Heart Goals and Criteria reads, a social awareness which impels to action. Here in Tokyo, the fourth criterion reads, as good stewards, the school community teaches and practices environmental sustainability to take care of the earth and each other. Stewards' gardens and the barnyard mirror all that Goal 3 implies about the awareness of one's place in an interconnected world. And we are not certainly the only school doing this, but I highlight Stuart as someone who does so embody this particular aspect of Sophie. So Sophie, with her love for the natural world, who understood the sacred dimensions of that natural world, understood very clearly that cut off from the earth, cut off from the vine, we are nothing. And I'll talk a little bit more about this vine later. But now I'd like us to lift our eyes from the earth to the stars, and in so doing, consider another of Sophie's quadrants. I have little doubt that had she been alive today, Sophie would have been fascinated by the new cosmology, that branch of physics and metaphysics dealing with the nature of the universe. One of my friends at Stanford is an Italian astrophysicist who works at the Linear Accelerator, where several discoveries have been made on subatomic particles. She is also a devout Catholic and is a frequent speaker on the uncanny similarities between the Big Bang and the biblical account of creation. Some of you might be familiar with Elia Delio, who writes a great deal on this. I have no doubt that these two women would have gotten along famously with one of Sophie's first novices at the school in Amiens. Her name was Cecile Cassini. Her great-grandfather was invited to Paris from the University of Bologna to set up the Paris Observatory in 1669. Giovanni Domenico Cassini had, among other things, discovered that the ring around Saturn was actually a series of multiple rings. The largest gap between the two rings is called the Cassini division. Another one of his discoveries helped settle once and for all the debate about the heliocentric universe. The historic Paris Observatory sits to this day on the Rue Cassini, and NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Association in the United States, their fourth exploration of Saturn launched a spacecraft that was called the Cassini. Anne Cecile Cassini, just 2 years older than Sophie, was literally born and raised at the Paris Observatory. She came to the first school in Amiens in 1803. She was one of Sophie's first teachers to teach astronomy, one of the many extraordinary intellects who gave Sophie's schools a reputation as centers of serious learning for women. But I mentioned her here because of the kind of intellect she embodied. She was descended from a long line of scientific literati, and her education, while it may have equaled that given to Sophie by her older brother, in some areas obviously surpassed Sophie's when it came to science. It seems she was a little bit difficult to manage. She was obsessed with her subject matter. She refused to teach anything except astronomy or geography because her father had also he did the first topographical map of France, I think. She exhibited a natural impatience of character, which made her, in Sophie's own words, want to throw the children out the window. At one point, she left the society, left school in a huff to join another religious order, but she came back, and Sophie allowed her to return. Cecile also seems to have had a bit of a sixth sense about her. One day, when a bumbling, stuttering, bedraggled young woman arrived on horseback at the school in Amiens, it was Cecile who noticed that when she was put in front of a group of students, she no longer stuttered, and in fact exhibited a genius in the classroom, holding her students spellbound. Perhaps it is no accident that Cecile Cassini's great-great-grandfather discovered the multiple rings around Saturn. There was an intuitive, imaginative capacity within his scientific mind that used the information stored within it and then moved into new territory. It would appear that Cecile inherited this gift. That Sophie embraced and enabled this brilliant but difficult teacher speaks, I think, to her understanding that Cecile Cassini could, despite wanting to throw her students out the window, inspire them with that same passion she felt for her subject matter. I would suggest that Cecile Cassini succeeded in making astronomy positively electric. She was known for having dared to teach the new metric system. One can only imagine the fervor with which she would have taught the solar system. Her stuttering friend, Catherine de Charbonnel, taught geometry by drawing huge geometric diagrams on the floor of the attic. One can envision the bewildered looks on students' faces as their mentors indulged in behavior that must have seemed odd, but that undoubtedly woke them up to the excitement of learning. The American novelist Walker Percy, who thought a great deal about teaching and learning, once wrote the following. School, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had it on the slide. Oh, that's her great-grandfather. That's the observatory. Those are the rings. So here we are. School is disappointing. If science is exciting and art is exhilarating, the schools and universities have achieved the not inconsiderable feat of rendering both dull. As every scientist and poet knows, one discovers both vocations in spite of, not because of, school. It takes years to recover from the stupor of being taught Shakespeare in English Lit and Wheatstone's Bridge in physics. I'm guessing Cecile Cassini's students never would have known such stupor. She understood that teaching is on some level an act of seduction. Through her own palpable, ebullient joy in learning, she ignited that of her students. I know we can all look around the room right now and see people like this. Sophie thought a great deal about excellence in teaching. She gathered the best minds around her when devising the first plan of studies, including Jean-Louis Loriquet, a Jesuit of enormous erudition whose work is still in print on Google Books. We know that at one point she became very concerned about the seriousness of purpose in the academics at the Paris school. The head at that time seemed to be more intent on turning out socially accomplished women to be wives of French leaders, and she went in and corrected it. But her greatest concern was that they loved God. For her, education was a means, not an end. The true end of a Sacred Heart education was to glorify or adore the heart of Jesus. Today, we speak of developing in our students a personal and active faith in God. But Sophie's way of arriving there was through a rigorous training of the intellect. In other words, developing the intellect in her students was key to her ultimate purposes. Some of you may know the work of the Irish poet Evan Boland. She co-directed, there she is, having some Guinness. She taught at Stanford. She headed the creative writing program there. She is a highly regarded poet. She passed away a few years ago. But for a few years, she attended our school at 91st Street in New York City. Her father was a diplomat. And she gave our graduation speech one year. We invited her to Atherton to come and speak. And her speech was one of the most powerful testimonies to Sacred Heart education I think I've ever heard. She said the greatest gift the religious of the Sacred Heart gave her was the nurturing of her creativity. Like Cecile Cassini, zoning in on her students' own academic gifts, the RSCJ saw something in Evan Boland that allowed her, she felt, to become the poet she became. Is there anything greater we can do for our students, or for that matter, for our colleagues? And is this not perhaps the most accurate way to describe Sophie's own intellect? For her intellect is obviously what we're discussing in this quadrant. Don't worry, I'm only doing 3 quadrants this morning. You've been sitting a long time, I know. It is the intellect that soars, that takes someone off to investigating Neptune's rings, or writing achingly beautiful poetry, or envisioning and implementing entirely new curriculum structures, which at least one person referred to earlier today. One of the heartening things I've been witnessing at home is a serious, intentional move toward building larger bridges between the humanities and the sciences, particularly medicine. Programs like Medical Humanities at Stanford, or the Art and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School, or programs in integrated medical humanities that are flourishing in every one of the countries represented here. I went online, and it's with all of us, wherever we are. These programs seek to push back against the advanced technology led by big data and artificial intelligence, and to promote integration between medicine and humanities in pursuit of human values. Such programs are the result of major conceptual leaps by graduate students and professors who are engaging their imaginations as well as their erudition and skill sets. But perhaps it's now time to leave the stars and planets and jump back down to Earth. For space programs and observatories and innovative curriculum planning need funding. It takes money to deliver the foundational knowledge and spark the imagination of those future geniuses who might develop a cure for pancreatic cancer or become our next poet laureate or our next inspirational Sacred Heart Polly. Sophie did not live in some ivory tower, though the thought of leaving and becoming a cloistered Carmelite did occur to her from time to time. Despite her romantic connection to the land and her communal ties with birds and animals, she did not become a Restoration-era hippie or seek solace in her own personal garden. She was a hard-nosed businesswoman at a time when women were rarely seen in the marketplace, much less listened to. A notable exception that I just discovered about 6 years ago is the Veuve Clicquot, those of you who like champagne. She was born almost exactly at the same moment Sophie was, and died almost exactly at the same time, and was married in a secret ceremony in the basement of her husband's chateau at the same time Sophie was making her vows. So she's the one who really made the champagne what it is today, not her husband. There's a new movie out called The Widow Clicquot that's supposed to be quite good. I remember very early in my career when I and my lay colleagues knew nothing about Sophie, except that she was a middle-class woman from a small town in France who had established an international corporation of schools for daughters of the rich and famous. Frankly, it all sounded a bit suspect. We wondered what Faustian bargain she had struck in order to make it happen, or what fairy godmother had waved a wand and turned a barrel maker's daughter into an empire builder. Permit me to relay one story evoking Sophie's third quadrant. In 1828, the society was given the Trinità dei Monti. Oh, there's level. They were given the Trinità dei Monti at the top of the Spanish Steps to house their school in Rome. Within 4 years, Sophie had opened a free school across the river in the Trastevere for working class children. And by 1837, there was a critical need for yet another building to house the Italian novitiate. She learned that the Borghese family was ready to sell a property on the Janiculum Hill, not far from the Vatican. It was called the Villa Lante. Not only was it a 16th century architectural gem, its view over Rome was so spectacular that 12 years later, during one of the battles of the Risorgimento, when Italy was becoming a country, Garibaldi took it over with his army and sent all the nuns across town to the Trinity. On the day Sophie arrived to check out the villa for a possible purchase, she made the immediate observation that it was too small. But what is that building down below, she asked, pointing to an enormous structure that was being used to store tobacco. That is the Ghost Palace, she was told. Popular belief was that it was haunted. I'll take the Villa Lante if I can have them both, was her reply. And the Borghese family, who owned the other one as well, eventually agreed to a deal. You can visit the Ghost Palace to this day. It houses the International Archives and reasonable accommodations for travelers. If you're traveling in Rome, you can stay there. The woman thought big. It's probably not insignificant that Sophie had done her father's accounts when she was a very young teenager. Her mother was having some sort of nervous breakdown because her brother was at risk in prison. Jacques Barat's barrel-making business included clients all over France, not just in Joigny. And he was also engaged in winemaking, so the accounts must have been fairly complex, and Sophie was doing them when she was about 15 years old. We know from Sophie's embroidery, oh, I'm sorry, this is the Ghost Palace. It's hard to get a good picture of it, but this is where you can go stay. We know from this piece of embroidery that Sophie did of the Sacred Heart that she was a very accomplished seamstress. One of the censuses from the time had her listed as a seamstress. And she was very concerned in the schools for working class children that they learn a skill, and in many cases for the women it was as part of the textile industry. There are many, many stories that show she was adamant about her workers being paid on time. She spent what I'm sure she felt to be an obscene amount of time worrying about maintenance and money issues. Several years ago, I worked with a religious of the Sacred Heart, Susan Maxwell, who was writing a history of the creation of the United States network of schools in the late 1960s and 70s. She writes about the entrepreneurial skills of both religious and lay people to save the schools, as many of them were closing or facing closure in the wake of Vatican II. Among the many documents Sister Maxwell cites is one which emerged from the 1967 chapter, and Annie just explained what a chapter was. There's one going on now. The society, the document reads, will collaborate with other educational organizations. It will integrate lay people into its apostolic work, recognizing that this means we must admit them to the same level as religious in administrative functions, listen to them, recognize their right to vote, and use their initiative. We can't appreciate from our perspective what this meant, but it must have been very unsettling to many of the RSCJ at the time. When I first arrived in Atherton in 1972, they had just formed an advisory board that evolved into our first board of trustees, so moving into that same realm of other independent schools and colleges. Another document Sister Maxwell cites came from a trustee in Greenwich, our school in Greenwich, Connecticut, who wrote the following. The tradition of Sacred Heart education was preserved through the 19th and most of the 20th century, almost exclusively through the members of the Society of the Sacred Heart. The challenge before us, lay and religious, is to preserve the tradition beyond the boundaries of the 20th and even the 21st century, if we are to live up to the challenge. It will depend upon a true partnership of lay and religious men and women. And certainly, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, especially in view of what's happening in Australia. I had no idea that you'd form this association, so this trustee would have been quite happy to see this happening. But if you really think about it, we are, on some level, educational entrepreneurs as we forge this new world of Sacred Heart schools in the absence of RSCJ. At some point, we will be collaborating exclusively, as do the schools in Australia, with an idea, a vision, an intuition. One theologian, often quoted by those religious who created the first network of Sacred Heart schools, called this practice imagining the future into being. The future, he wrote, belongs to whoever can envision, in the manifold of its possibilities, a new inevitability. He called it the politics of hope, a hope that, quote, envisions its future and then acts as if that future is irresistible, thus helping to create the reality for which it longs. This is where I want to leave you this morning, with the idea of imagining a future into being that springs out of what Madeleine Sophie Barat imagined over 2 centuries ago. I have obviously left one quadrant out. The fourth quadrant is obviously Sophie, the contemplative. But it was from this act of contemplation and prayer, that she drew her strength. And we'll devote the first half of the afternoon to this quadrant. And there will be time for contemplation. I'm not going to talk at you for 2 hours, so don't worry. So we will come back and we'll have some time for meditation. Then I want to talk a little bit about this last quadrant of Sophie, the contemplative piece. And then we'll have another moment, a few minutes, for another short meditation, and then we'll be breaking up into groups and talking a little bit. So my hope is that by the end of the day, we will see Sophie as this still point that is the center of everything we're about. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have right now. I suspect everyone's very eager to get to lunch. But if there is something you'd like to ask me, please approach me. Feel free to talk to me during our long lunch period. And I thank you very much for your attention.